In this presentation, we'll zoom deeper into God's plan for Israel in the world, as it will unfold within the context of kingship institution. And we have called this part Ambassadors of Hope. David, he turned out to be the most successful king in Israel. Although his contemporaries probably didn't look at him that way, but more about that later. Now, the one who really reaps, should I say, the benefits of the achievements of David is his son Solomon. He is the one that is going to promote the great temple building in Jerusalem. He is also the one that declared at the inauguration of this temple, "This shall be a house of prayer for all people." Something seems to indicate that Solomon at that stage understood what God's purpose with Israel really was. Lead the world into the worship of God. Now, but he later turned Israel into what we would call a great trading empire, according to the story. Israel was now controlling the trading routes of the world at the crossroad between Africa, Asia, and also Europe. They were sitting on it on the sea, and they were sitting on it on the land. And according to the story, when you read it, it's a very exciting story to read how he actually managed Solomon, how he built up not only a formidable army for the nation itself, but he also became the great arms trader or arms dealer in the ancient world. We read that he was importing and exporting horses and chariots from Egypt. And if we know what that means in the ancient terms, it is our day panzer. He was a great exporter of that to the whole world, and he made an abundance of money out of the trade. But he also became a megalomania. According to the story, he became the great arms dealer of the world. When we hear about horses and chariots, it is equivalent in our terminology today to be the great importer and exporter of panzer. This is the kind of thing he was dealing in. But he also became a tyrant eventually. He began to abuse his power. He began to enslave people. We read that he had up to 170,000 slaves. And he imposed heavy taxation in order to fund his building projects. And he would eventually take steps that would lead Israel to division and ruin. So God now takes action in the story, as we have already heard. The blessings and curses. What will he do now? We read, "Then the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, who had appeared to him twice." Now, Solomon had been privileged that God had spoken to him twice, personally, who appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning these matters. So he knew better than he acted. And we read further that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. To make a very long story short, Solomon ignored the covenant. He abused the charter and the constitution. He enslaved people. He imposed heavy taxes to fund his building projects. He also forged foreign relations and alliances with other nations in abundance. Now, we read about his 1,000 wives and concubines is not simply because he was fond of women. He probably was, just like his father. But 1,000, I mean, that's a big deal. Now, this was the ancient way of forging alliances with other nations. You intermarried with the royal houses, and in this way you cemented the relationships. So this is what's about. Especially one thing has been highlighted in the reign of Solomon. That is his import of gold. Now, gold for ancient kings were Alpha and Omega. That was the sign of their success. Gold, 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 gold. Plenty of gold. So this was a high marker that highlighted, should I say, the success of his reign and everything he was doing. Now we read the following, and that's interesting. The weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year, they are highlighting 1 year, was 666 talents of gold. Besides that, from the traders and the business of the merchants. And the gold import is here highlighted as a marker of his success as a wealth-generating king. And its number was 66. Now, Solomon's empire still had a godly face, we should remember. But inwardly, it was already corrupted and disloyal to God, and were fast becoming what later prophets would call a prostitute. This is the word they will use to describe the way the Israelites behaved in their foreign relationships, the way they forged alliances with other nations to secure their security, their influence, and their wealth and power. Other prophets will use very graphic language bordering on what we today would call pornographic descriptions to describe Israel's international lovemaking. That's the way they talk about it. As a modern saying goes, they made love the old friend's way, who cares with whom as long as it pays. Now the prophets had strong words about that. By the way, John the Revelator will use this imagery of the great prostitute when he describes a future development within Christendom. But back to Solomon. God said to him, "Since this has been your mind, and you have not kept my covenants and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant." And he continues speaking to Solomon, saying, "I will tear it out of the hands of your son. I will not however tear it away in the entire kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David." God's next move is to break up the great trading empire of Solomon. And it actually happened when Solomon died. The people came to his son and begged him to lift the heavy burdens of taxation and slavery and discontinue the abuse of power and tyranny and so on. But Solomon's son, being a great fool, he actually threatened the people and said, "If my father has whipped you with the one lash, I'll use even harder treatment of you." In other words, he says, "I will increase his tyranny." And we read that the tribes revolted against him and said, "What do we have with the house of David anymore?" So now the kingdom is divided into the two kingdoms of Judah and Israel. These are the two. The massive part of Israel, the northern part, the 10 tribes, rebelled not only against the house of Solomon, but they also rebel against God's plan for the people. Now, the northern kingdom of Israel will have 21 kings who all, as a matter of policy, will try to, shall we say, replace the worship of God in Jerusalem for idolatry. And they are successful. The route of the northern kingdom was fast and quick. In less than 150 years, the nation collapsed, and its people were exiled into the empire of Assyria. And in the year 722, it was all over. A remnant of godly fearing or God-fearing people in the northern kingdom fled to Judah, and Judah itself held out for another 150 years until it finally collapsed and was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire in 586. Thus the great divorce occurred, according to the prophets. The covenant, they speak about the covenant as a marriage between Israel and God, and they are declaring that this marriage is finally broken. God is sending Israel off as a divorced woman. The covenant is broken. And this is the point. Israel is sent away as an adulterer. This is the language they use. As a divorced woman, Israel is given over to their enemies, their former lovers, as they talk about it, those they made love with. They are going to plunder them and destroy them. God is simply withdrawing from Israel. And we enter an era in which God seems to be completely absent in the life of the people of God. But as Israel now slides towards what we would call disaster, a prophetic voice will begin to speak louder and louder within the people of Israel. And they will begin to point to a time beyond the coming catastrophe. And I call them prophets of hope. They are operating in that era when things are going from bad to worse. There is a voice speaking within Israel and saying, yeah, there will be darkness. Yes, there will be gloom. It will go the wrong way, as we have already noticed it did, but someday beyond the disaster. So, the first prophetic voice we want to look at before we look at Isaiah is the prophet Nathan. Now, he was speaking in the days of David. Now, and he came on the scene, when David was finally settled as king over Israel. And the king asked the prophet Nathan to come to him because he had some plans. And David wanted to honor God, who has been great to him, and he wanted to strengthen the worship of Israel. So he planned to build a temple for God. We read it this way: now when the king was settled in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, the king said to the prophet Nathan. We continue. See, now I am living in the house of cedar, but the ark of the Lord stays in a tent. To make a long story short, when we talk about the Ark of the Covenant, we are back to the centerpiece, in the center of the Israelite worship, where God's glory or Shekinah dwelt, the very heart of it, and was the center of their worship. Now David, he wants to build a temple in Jerusalem to the honor of God, because David understood that the strength and greatness of Israel were centered in their loyalty and their loyalty and relationship to God. But God had other plans. Instead, God reveals his plan to the house of David and tells him what his plans are with the house of David. God will consolidate the kingship office as an integrated part of the Israelite constitution. This is what we are now going to hear. Actually, God plans that this kingship institution, with David as the first office holder, will be central agency through which God's plan in the future for Israel and its mission in this world will actually be carried out. This is the way it is being done. Now, here the words are from the prophet Nathan. I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. This is great. This is really fabulously great. It's the launch pad for, should I say, an everlasting reign set up within the people of Israel. And David is being articulated as the first office holder in this eternal kingdom. A new institution is being established within the realm of Israel. A rule and reign that will last into all eternity. We need to notice that the words that are used here for everlasting, ad olam in Hebrew, is actually the word used by God to refer to a rule and reign that will be without end, forever. This is amazing. This is actually breathtaking what you're reading here. It's downright mind-blowing. But according to the narrative, God continues and reaffirms what he has just been saying. We read, I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I'll punish him, but I'll not take away my steadfast love from him as I took it away from Saul. I want you to notice the father-son language here, which is used to designate the position of the anointed king in Israel. It's a special relationship with God. Whoever holds the office in the kingship line of David in the future is called the Son of God. And he can rightfully call God his Father. This is a unique relationship that exists between the Anointed One and God. As a human agency, he's God's servant in this world. Or should I say, who is going to carry out God's plan for the world. Actually, we further read, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever. Before me shall be your throne shall be established. So God here affirms his promise to David, and he repeats it. A second and a third time he emphasizes that it is going to be forever. What is here established, we should notice, is a reign of God in the world, destined for all eternity. This is the radicalness of this promise to David. And as the story goes, David takes the beeline straight into the sanctuary and begin to pray to God and make a confession. He said, who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house that you have brought me that far? You have also spoken of your servant's house for a great while to come. Let that be instruction for the people. Now the word Torah that is being used here for instruction is simply another word that we meet again talking about God's instruction. And in this case here, it's God's plan for the world through the house of David. David clearly understands that God is here speaking about his charter for Israel, nothing less than a second amendment to the covenant with Abraham. As the kingship institution is now consolidated into the very constitutional charter of Israel itself. In other words, if we use the modern terminology, it's nothing less than God proclaiming a lasting world order. 8 times it was stated that this reign and this rule will last forever, that is, ad olam, into all eternity. It may have a small beginning, but according to this promise, it's going to end big. I want you to notice this. So the expanded charter for Israel will be the next great lens in which, in the biblical telescope, it's what it's going to be. A lens that began with Abraham is expanded with Moses and the covenant at Sinai, and is now finalized with David. David clearly understood the constitutional significance of this divine declaration, and as he reflects on this promise that God has given him. In another place, David is referring to this and saying, "Now these are the last words of David, for he has made me an everlasting covenant, ordered it in all things, and secure." Now, this is a public promise. This is not a private message. It's repeated by the prophets. They will use it, they will apply it, and they will look at the future fulfillment of Israel's task in this world through that lens. Now, it will be expressed in hymns like the following, Psalm 89. Forever I'll give, actually in this psalm there is an almost verbatim, should I say, repetition of the great promise to David. And then it ends like this: "Forever I'll keep my steadfast love for him, and my covenant with him will stand firm. I'll establish his line forever, and his throne as long as the heavens endure." So in their perception, Davidic kingship is the beginning of an everlasting kingdom that shall never end. This is breathtaking. So the priests, they will sing about it in the temple worship. And the faith of the worshippers will be nurtured by it. They are listening to this. And the prophets will use it as a launch pad for speaking about how Israel will fulfill the God's given mission in the future. Especially the prophet Isaiah is interesting here. He will zoom in on the promise of David and will use it. And he will simply see the future of Israel and the world through that one lens. This is what he's going to do. He will speak hope in a time when Israel is tumbling towards ruin and the dark night of disaster. That's what he's going to do. And to that vision we shall now turn. We want to listen to what he's doing with it, how he understands it. In Isaiah 9:2 we read, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who live in the land of deep darkness, on them light has shined." Light, darkness are two very strong pictures and metaphors that are being used here. The contrast couldn't be bigger. It's a powerful imagery. So what is the prophet Isaiah talking about? In the historic context, it's the Assyrian, should I say the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom. That's the immediate context for what he's talking about. And its threat against Judah and Jerusalem. These are indeed dark days, as we read. And read as follows: "They will turn their faces upwards, and they will look to the earth, but they will see only distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they'll be thrust into thick darkness." For the people, their situation seems hopeless. And now the prophet explains exactly what this disaster is all about. He says, "But there will be no more gloom for those who were in anguish. In the former times he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali." Now here the prophet is zooming in of two of the leading tribes in the northern kingdom. Now they are utter disaster. Now they suffer disaster, but someday there will be a great reverse in the future. That's what he's talking about. And he continues, "But in the latter times he will make glorious the ways of the sea, the land beyond Jordan, Galilee of the nations." So the drama is very clear here. The larger part of the Israel nations are spiraling towards disaster, and Judah is simply hanging on with its teeth. That's all that is left. So the promise is clear. Someday there will be light at the end of the tunnel of history. Darkness will go. Light will shine. So what is that great light that Isaiah is seeing at the end of the tunnel beyond catastrophe? The prophet says the following: "You have multiplied the nations, you have increased its joy. For the yoke of their burden and their bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressors, you have broken as on the day of Midian." Someday there will be deliverance. As it further is stated in the text, there will be no more war. There will be no more oppression. There will be no more evil. There will be no more, no more, no more, no more. That's what the text is saying if you read it. So what is the secret of this great future reverse, according to the prophet Isaiah? What is the great light that is going to shine at the end of the tunnel, so to speak? And now the prophet springs his surprise, for we read the following: "But a child has been born for us, a son is given us, authority rests on his shoulders. His authority shall grow continually, and there shall be endless peace for the throne of David and his kingdom." The light that will one day shine on Israel is a future son born into the house of David. See how they use the kingship motif and promise here. Rescue, deliverance will come thanks to the great covenant that God has made with David. And with him, the rule of goodness will once more return. And you missed the force of what is being said in this text the first time round. We will just continue. "He will establish and uphold it throne," that is the throne of David, "with justice and with righteousness from this time onward and forevermore." The seal of the Lord host will do this. Someday, some future son of David will emerge and bring God's plan for the world through Israel to its fulfillment, and restore the rule of goodness once and for all in this world. Nothing less than that. This is what the promise entails. The coming of the one unique Son, the coming unique King, the coming unique reign. In other words, that kings that rules the way God rules is a true son of David. Now David himself understood this when he said the following: "The rock of Israel has said to me," one who rules our people justly, ruling in the fear of God, is like the light of morning, like the sun rising on a cloudless morning. Now, Isaiah is not the first one to use the metaphor light. David has already used that metaphor as a description of what a true kingship is all about. And what Isaiah is pronouncing here, he's simply echoing these words of David. And he's saying that someday, out of the house of David, there will be an ultimate son of David born, who will reflect fully and completing, should I say, the attributes of God and rule the way God rules. Listen what Isaiah is saying. His name shall be Wonderful Counselor. This shall be Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, Mighty God. So, attributes of God has been ascribed to this future son of David, whoever he is. Actually, this is breathtaking. This is deep. It's out of this world completely. It's like opening a window and the light you see is blinding. This is mind-blowing, even within, should I say, the logic of the Israelite narrative, but here it is. It's the one single lens in the biblical telescope that will focus the remaining story and its direction. Building up a messianic expectation and a future hope of Israel in times of increasing darkness. So our next presentation will focus on this theme, and name it the Promised One.